And hello and welcome to the College Drive and Stream City Sports on the YouTube side of things. As we jump in there and look at a couple things, we're going to talk about the championship game for Monday night, which should never be played on Monday, should be played on a Saturday. I think we're all pretty clear about that. That is nothing but a money grab by ABC and ESPN. And while I get that that's what you're there for. You're there to make money. It's not a game that should be played on a Monday night. And we're seeing this with all the sports. It's not just a college football phenomenon. It is where they want to place all college athletics for the championship games is on a Monday night when half the country's got to get up and go to work early the next morning. It limits the ability of people to throw championship parties like they do for the Super Bowl, which I still say should be on a Saturday as well, but at least they are playing it on their traditional football Sunday for the NFL. College football should be played on a Saturday. It just should be, or on New Year's Day. There's a novel thought. But we did get a great game. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to preview what we're talking about on Monday because I kind of want to set the stage for a debate that I want to have on. You're hearing a lot right now about the strength of the conferences. We're going to get into that, and then we're going to do. If you're on the radio side of things, we're going to do the college travel show, college sports travel show, or I guess sports travel show is what we'll call it. Those episodes will drop on YouTube. Will drop on Saturdays. Drop on Saturdays. So we'll get that out for you. And but we're going to start out talking about the championship game, which it turned out to be a fantastic game. And we're gonna kind of break that down, talk about what we saw, and also talk about the officiating a little bit. And I think all in all, the Big 12 crew did a pretty good job. They were consistent. I give them that. I think they went out of their way to not interject themselves into the game. And by doing so, I think they kind of inadvertently did. And we'll talk about that because I think it was called very evenly. I will say that. I think the way they called it was a clear advantage to Miami. Now, did it make a difference in the game? No, absolutely not. And, what I was somewhat prepared for, actually kind of got the game that I hoped for as far as the competitive side of it. And I felt like there was a good possibility. Felt like it was a 50-50 thing. I thought we could either get a game that looked like that or we could get a lopsided Indiana game. You really weren't sure what you were going to get out of that. Everybody's hyped the Big Ten so heavily this year to the point of, well, you really kind of felt like maybe this Indiana club was a group that was just such a formidable foe that nobody could challenge them. Well, we found out that wasn't the case, and we got a great football game, and it was a great football game. And the one thing I will say is there were a couple of situations where it could have become a not great football game. And those, because of the way the Big 12 officials called the game, it didn't go that route. And what I'm talking about is what we have, those of us that were around back when Miami was relevant, which has been a minute, they had a well-deserved and earned reputation of being a dirty football team. It's why I said Mark Richt would not be super successful at Miami, is because to be successful at Miami, it feels like you have to be dirty. And Mark Richt was not going to. So you were going to either have a culture change at Miami, which I think you had a little bit of, or you were going to see him ultimately not be successful. And that's what, the reality is they're a dirty football team. And it showed again. And luckily for them, and I guess all of us because it stayed a closer game, there were multiple roughing the passer calls that should have been thrown. Cignetti addressed it at halftime, and he was 100% correct. They were clear. Roughing the passer, one should have gone probably as a targeting call. It didn't. That would have greatly changed, I think, Miami's ability to slow Indiana down. And I think Indiana gets a touchdown on the drive that ultimately they end up getting a field goal. Now, does that change the outcome of the game? No, it didn't. I think it kept it as a closer game because of the fact that Miami kept all of their players in the ball game, and you had a field goal on that drive as opposed to a touchdown. And, what you saw was, what I'll say, I think both defensive backfields were allowed to be very handsy in this ball game. And I think that benefited Miami. They are very physical. They play on the edge. And because they let it go, and we saw it, same thing in the game between Miami and Ole Miss. There were multiple what could have been called as pass interferences that were not called in that game. One very questionable towards the end of the game, but it was called consistently. And at the end of the day, whether I think something should be a pass interference or not, if we're seeing consistency out of the officials, that's at the end of the day, that's all we can ask for. And they were very consistent about how they called that ball game. They were very hands-off and let the defensive backs play. And ultimately, I would rather see that. I'd rather see pass interference not get called than it'd be a flag fest, because that just ruins the flow of a game. And then at that point, the officials become way too big a part of it. And we didn't see that happen. So ultimately, I would have to give an A to the officiating overall, but there were definitely there were definitely roughing the passer calls that were not thrown that clearly should have been. There were I'm going to downgrade that to B+, because there were some other ones. There was one in the end zone where it was an incomplete pass on 3rd and long, and the Miami player clearly hits the Indiana player in the helmet after the play. Should have been 15 yards, should have been a first down. Didn't happen. So I think we've seen it with the SEC. There becomes a fatigue factor. The SEC did not get calls a lot of times in national championship games or playoff games simply because there was some fatigue. I think a little bit of that's starting to happen to the Big Ten. I think the Big Ten is starting to deal with that same thing where their teams, maybe by officials from other conferences, and there are always going to be officials from other conferences, are a little more hesitant to throw the flag for the group that has been dominant, which is kind of counterintuitive and the opposite of what we see oftentimes in the NFL, where if you're the team that's been on top, you're going to get every flag. And I think maybe there's a little overcorrection with the NCAA, which, given the two, I think I like better, to be honest. If we're going to give the benefit of the doubt to get us a better football game, probably need to give it to the underdog team, not the team that has been on top. Now, you cannot argue with the Indiana story. This has been a fantastic story. I was really torn going into this ball game. Do you pull for Indiana and the Big Ten? So I kind of divorced myself from that and said I'm pulling for Indiana, just basically because Miami's a dirty football team, and I know there's a lot of my Georgia friends that were pulling hard against Carson Beck. I don't really get that. Beck, to me, everybody wants to be very critical of him. And I don't know the young man personally. There's a lot of things that are said about him that I don't know whether they're true or not. Here's what I do know about Carson Beck. He stuck it out at Georgia when most people in this day and age simply do not. They bail and run. They're going to go, where they know they can start. Carson Beck didn't do that. He waited his time behind a guy who was started out a walk-on, and you're highly recruited. Most people would have left. He didn't. He stuck it out with Georgia. Now, I do believe, what gets a little tiring is the narrative that you continue to be spun by Fowler and Herbstreit when you see the Miami broadcast about how somehow he was done wrong by Georgia. Well, no, he wasn't. He was never done wrong by Georgia. Georgia, I think, stood by him. Now, some Georgia fans, however, I will say this. I think he is at Miami partially because of the whiny contingent of the Georgia fans, and every single school has them. But when you're Carson Beck and you've come up short a few times, and that those people get louder and louder and louder, I think it can be hard to overlook and get past. And I think that part of it, was starting to wear on Carson Beck. And at the end of the day, you're dealing with a guy in his early 20s. That's natural. Heck, it might get to me at that age. At this age, I could care less. But that's not where you're at in your 20s. So I think that played a role in him leaving, and a bunch of money didn't hurt either. And that's one of the things that I think we're starting to see now is we are seeing purchase national titles again. The reality is you had both these teams were full of players that had been paid to come in. You had, and I think it applied last year to Ohio State as well, but the difference was Ohio State spent a lot of their money retaining their players. So that's a little bit different. Actually, it's a lot different. But at the end of the day, it was a massive payroll. And they got a national title out of it. But, and it's not a criticism. This is the way the rules are now, or the lack of rules are now. We don't have set rules. What's going on in college football is breaking the rules. Very simply. All 136 teams should be on probation because none of them, NIL is not NIL. We're doing pay to play, and that is against NCAA rules. What we're doing is illegal by NCAA bylaws, period. It is the way we're doing business because we don't have anybody running the show. Nobody's in charge. That said, what I saw in Indiana and what I saw all year in Indiana is an extraordinarily disciplined football team. And it's an older football team, and people were going to say, well, you're saying they bought it. They bought it and then they earned it. Because we've seen how Florida State tried to buy it a few years ago, and it was an absolute disaster. So spending the money doesn't guarantee you anything. You've got to bring that talent in. You better assess the talent correctly, and you better be able to coach them. Now, a lot of those guys came from the lower level of James Madison. By the way, everybody critical of James Madison. James Madison, look at the number of players on Indiana that transferred from James Madison, a team that, oh, by the way, made the playoff this year. Now, yes, did they get smacked around by Oregon? Absolutely they did. But if you watch that game, they had their opportunities early. They moved the ball on Oregon early. They just couldn't turn it into touchdowns. And when you're the underdog, you can't do that. You can't kick field goals. You can't miss field goals. And you can't give up big plays. They did all of the above. And it ended up being a lopsided football game. But getting back to the championship game, I thought both teams did a pretty good job of controlling the run game. They both gave up some big ones. Miami gets the 60-yard or 59-yard or 57-yard touchdown run, which accounted for about more than half of their rushing yards for the game. So Indiana did a great job of controlling that. And to be honest with you, in the first half, and this was with, in the first half, Carson Beck didn't have anybody to throw to. His receivers simply were not getting separation. It looked a lot like what he dealt with his last year at Georgia, where you had contested balls were dropped and there was no separation. I mean, he was throwing into very, very tight windows. And I know he gets the interception at the end of the ball game that a lot of people are going to look at. So, it cost him the ball game. No, it didn't. It cost you the opportunity to win the ball game. But the reality is you missed a field goal earlier in the game, or else you're driving down there for a tying field goal, which greatly changes the play calling, which I found to be pedestrian for Miami. They needed to establish the run because let's face it, outside of Tony, your receivers are okay. You didn't have fantastic receivers out of Tony. And while he got his to a degree, he didn't take over the ball game, which we've seen him do in a lot of ball games this season. He didn't do that in that ball game. And the reality is that was one of the key things that Indiana had to do. Now, Indiana was the better team. But this notion that they were this unstoppable force, Miami could have beat them. When you look at all the indicators, whether it is penalties, turnovers, special teams, they all skewed for Indiana to win this ball game. When you block a block punt in a college football game puts your win total somewhere in the 90% range. I mean, that's almost a given that if I have a block punt, you don't have one, I'm probably winning this football game. Turnovers, to me, you only had one, and that was the Carson Beck turnover late in the ball game, which at the time, I guess you could say is a huge deal. It is, because it ends the ball game. But at the same time, it wasn't like you were on the 10-yard line and threw the interception. You still had a lot of distance to get to a touchdown in that ball game. So to say that cost Miami the ball game, I think is a little disingenuous. And at the end of the day, while it ends the ball game, there are turnovers that can happen earlier in the ball game that have a lot bigger long-term effect, because everything has a trickle-down effect for the remainder of the football game. So while yes, it was a huge deal in the fact that it ends the ball game, I can't say it cost Miami the ball game. But you gave up a blocked punt, you missed a field goal, and you had 0 takeaways. That is not the recipe for winning a football game. That actually is kind of the recipe for getting beat badly in a football game, which did not happen. Miami had every opportunity to win this ball game late, and that speaks maybe more to the strength of Miami than it does anything else. Miami is a very good football team. Now, what they'll have next year, we'll have to wait and see. I think the biggest advantage Indiana had was in coaching. Cignetti's a great coach. Now, am I ready to throw him in the conversation of the best coaches in college football? Going to have to do it a little bit longer than 2 years at the major level for me. Now, is he definitely trending in that direction? Absolutely. Because I don't think Indiana's disappearing. Because here's what we've got, and this will take us into the conversation that we're going to have in the next segment of the show, is the strength of the conferences. The reality is Indiana is now up there with Ohio State, and that's about it. I think we've seen that Oregon, maybe a bit of a paper tiger. We're going to take a break on the radio side, and we will continue to talk about that specific thing, the strength of the conferences. This is going to be our show on Monday. I haven't really dug into it deep yet. I'm going to spend the weekend doing that. We're going to come back, but I'm going to tell you what I think we will find, and then we will see if it works out that way, because we'll come with the numbers on Monday. Back in a moment here on Stream City Radio and Stream City Sports, as you see producer Blue in the corner playing with my helmets.